Today, going over some of the difficult ones and finally addressing the elephant in the room. Colossal Order have finally answered the tough questions. How do you plan to get out of this mess? What's in the works to fix Cities 2? What will you do to set things right for the disaster launch of CS2? We'll answer these questions, but first we'll go over some useful background information, learn a bit about what they're working on right now, the fixes they're currently working on, and we'll end the video with some very interesting rapid-fire questions. Let's jump in. We begin today's wild and juicy journey with perhaps a somewhat more of a focused and rather specific question. Are you going to address the content creators' concerns and criticisms? This, I have to imagine, directed at Biffa's somewhat recent video. They say that, of course, all constructive feedback that they receive is valued and very much appreciated, and thank people who tagged and shared those content creators' videos with them, highlighting feedback that they agree with and being part of discussions. They list the example indeed of Biffa and City Planner Plays, who both released videos with useful and constructive criticism that they've gone over internally within the team. They'll be addressing that feedback according to the process that they've laid out in a very handy image. So, if you're interested, very quickly, here's a look at their feedback process. It starts by collecting feedback, then through to design and vision, where feedback is reviewed by their game designers and compared to their vision for the game. Then they'll determine some improvements and prioritize and implement them based on their programmers and the current priorities for the game. Then testing. The dev team and quality assurance test begins, and changes take place to ensure that everything's working properly. This is then reiterated and tested again before finally the patch is rolled out. When the build has passed all the required tests, it's released, and the feedback process starts again. And I'm sure it's a process that has spun its wheels many times already now. That stuff all fairly standard, kind of interesting to see a little look inside of the hood into a process that they have talked about a little bit already. They go on to give some examples of some smaller changes in the game that they've made based on the public feedback, not just the high and mighty content creators' view, but actually everybody's view, because that's what matters. Things like adding a line color to passenger ships, cargo ships, and train engines, improving movement pathfinding, preventing citizens from reserving homes from disconnected buildings, or moving into a city at all if it's not connected to the outside. And also, finally, increasing all emergency vehicle siren sound distances. You might be thinking, Jumbo, buddy, this is minor stuff. And I mean, indeed, they've acknowledged small changes. Let's move swiftly along, and as they rightly acknowledge, to something far more interesting. And the intensity only ramps up from here, but first, some things that they thought would be interesting, some larger changes that Colossal Order are looking at right now, investigating at some point in that feedback process to implement in Cities Skylines 2. There are 5 of them. The first one, land value. Big problems around that, of course, and zone suitability. Secondly, the education system, specifically for kids and teens. My lord, I hope they do something about those schools and the school capacity and the size of them, everything around that. The third point that they're working on right now based on our feedback, more transparency within the economic system to know what's actually going on. This would help, of course, also a little bit in their PR campaign to dispel some rumors around things that may or may not be falsely simulated, and those simulations, of course, may or may not be broken. Fourthly, they're working on balancing subsidies, those massively overpowered, look out, government subsidies that basically just float the entire economy, and service importing as well. And finally, balancing the negative happiness modifiers with lack of basic utilities. That's lacking in water, sewage, and electricity. They intend to balance those negative modifiers. So that's what they're working on at the moment based on feedback. Now we'll move into another question, another long form question, and then in the later part of the video we'll get to those quickfire Q&A questions. But first, let's stick with the long form stuff. And they've finally address the elephant in the room. That one thing that we've been wanting. Have they done it perfectly? Probably not. But they've finally addressed, how do you plan to get out of this mess? What is in the works to fix City Skylines 2? And what will you do to set things right for the disaster launch of City Skylines 2? This is probably as close to an apology as people who want that will get. But more importantly, it's drilling into these unanswered questions, finally getting Colossal Order's view. It's probably best to read this first part, at least verbatim, so that's what I'm going to do. They say, we'd much rather be in a different position than we are in at the moment, but we cannot change the past. We're working very hard to catch up on the missing modding support, missing platforms, the content for the Ultimate Edition, and improving the performance and fixing bugs this year. This team is divided to work on different tasks, so that we're seeing progress on all fronts. And while it might not feel that's fast enough, I can assure you we are all doing the best we can. Only time will tell if this is enough to turn things around. And that's the end of that opening part. I find that last statement particularly damning. Only time will tell if this is enough to turn things around. I think a favorable interpretation of that is that maybe directed towards people who view City Skylines 2 negatively, who have maybe insulted, abused the devs, whatever. Those people who they view they won't be able to convince, they're saying, you know, this might not be enough to convince them. Alternatively, it could also be read as, we don't know if this will be enough to fix City Skylines 2. I hope it's not that second part. And indeed, as we move through the rest, I think it'll be reinforced that it's probably not that second part of my interpretation. So, let's move on to the next point. They say there have also been many questions about the patch cadence, and why they moved away from weekly patches. They argue that weekly patches are too heavy for them to keep up with. The issues that they're working on need more time than just a few hours or days to fix. A small team of 30 developers have to plan the way they work that creates the fastest results. So instead of spending a big part of the week working on build deliveries, quality assurance rounds, those parts of the feedback process that we discussed earlier, they can use that time to work on the fixes themselves. Basically, what they're saying there is, instead of going through this build delivery, quality assurance, all of these tick box exercises for lots of small patches that always take, let's say, 3 days each, they're better off to spend a lot of time fixing problems and then just do that once. And also, the problems are kind of complicated. In terms of the Ultimate Edition, they say that for the Ultimate Edition, the DLCs are ready and have a rough schedule. So they'll have good opportunities to patch the game at the same time as they roll out. However, this doesn't mean that they'll never patch the game in between DLC releases. The goal is to improve the game as quickly as possible, and when they have a solid patch ready and it's tested, it will be released. And finally, in reply to that how do you get out of this mess question, they sum it up and also return to that slightly damning only time will tell if this will be enough. I am your father statement. They say, we are aware we have a mountain to climb when it comes to delivering on the expectations, but we have our ice picks ready and we are surely used to the cold. We're going to keep on climbing, and you'll continue to see that progress in the game. That's how they wrap that one up. I think working on it, working hard, give us some time, because there are big challenges still ahead of us, would be a fair synopsis of that answer. Boy, it is a biggie this week. Moving on to the final long-form answer. Why wasn't modding support available at release? They say, the biggest regret we have, the biggest regret they have, is that modding support is not yet available for the game. They go on to argue, we have been working on it since the beginning of the project, and the intent was to have it fully ready at release. Code modding support, map, and asset editing were all planned to be fully usable and mods shareable in one place. We still believe that offering modding support makes any game better, and that tools and mods should be available for all players to enjoy at no additional cost. Colossal Order say that during the project they faced, and still continue to face, technical difficulties that affect the speed and quality of the development, especially performance. They say they simply ran out of time as the focus had shifted from modding support to all hands on DECK to fix performance. All this work is still ongoing. I can only assume, therefore, that it's still all hands on deck. And clearly it is, and also clearly there goes the monetization on this video. Beans on toast for tea yet again. They move on to say, finally, in answer to this question, we'll be communicating more on the status of modding soon. It's not an ideal situation, but we're committed to keep working on this part of the game because it means so much to you and to us. A Colossal Order game is a moddable one, is a promise we've made to ourselves years ago and worked very hard to keep. So why hasn't modding support been added? In a nutshell, it was really hard. And then the release window came around, the delayed release window, so everybody had to rush to fix the game and focus on performance. And now they're still working on it, and we'll hear more about it soon. Perhaps not the most sort of conclusive answer you might have liked, and arguably a lot of things that we've discussed before, but the insight is still appreciated. And now finally, some actually very interesting rapid-fire questions. Firstly, more animations to come? Construction? Firemen? Etc.? The answer, yes. In the future, we'll be adding more animations to bring details and life to the cities. Secondly, when will we have cycle paths in City Skylines 2? The answer here, and one that I am personally disappointed about, and I don't even live in like a, you know, we bike everywhere kind of place. I live in a let me sit in my car and drone about traffic, sort of pathetically, for a long time place. But nonetheless, the answer here, sadly, I don't know when we'll get around to them. But City Skylines 2 will have bikes and bike paths. I think it's shocking that it doesn't already, especially when it has motorbikes and stuff. Like, it can't be, come on, it can't be that hard. I mean, they're in 2, and it bikes. Anyway, as somebody who basically never rides a bike, I don't know why I'm such a fierce advocate. Moving swiftly along. Will you add more types of buildings or special buildings? Answer, yes. There will be more buildings, both free and paid, for the game in the future. If there is something specific you hope to see, we'd love to hear it. Next, will we get actual keys, like the ones in CS1? Keys, of course, they're referring to that kind of concrete-y, sort of promenade-y, waterfront. I don't know. This sounds like it would fit great with the harbour-themed Bridges and Ports DLC coming later this year. That is a very broad scope for something that has already been delayed, and I suspect will be being delayed again if it hasn't already. Jeez, it's almost March. I'd just also like to briefly interrupt that frightful thought to ask you if you wouldn't mind. I know it's quite late in the piece and probably fairly fruitless, but maybe leaving a like on the video, or perhaps subscribing if you haven't subscribed already. The support would mean the world, particularly on these pieces that I try and put together at a high quality, but also relatively quickly. A rapid response, very early in the morning. Anyway, back to it. When will we get props? Adding the props to the menus for free placement in the game has come up as a request quite often. This is not something that they're actively looking into at the moment, but will be added to the wish list. The penultimate question, when will the land value issue finally be fixed? They say in the next update, we'll have part of it fixed, but the issues that are tied to the economy will take a bit longer to be resolved still. And finally, will there be biomes like wetlands, / jungle, or more desert like Texas? They say yes, we plan to add more maps with different biomes, and also assets for you to create your own. They conclude by saying thank you for all the questions as well as the criticism and feedback. It's valued and appreciated so long as it's constructive, and to keep it coming. And next week we'll hear from their art team, and that will conclude me for this week as well. Thank you so much for joining me in what I do think was probably the most interesting word of the week, at least in recent memory. It certainly left me with a lot to think about, and they at least tried to tackle some of the harder questions, so credit. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I always read through the ones on these videos in particular. I'll see you next time.